Hi there. Welcome once again to Prices at the Pumps on SaltWire, our weekly look at all things energy related. I'm Scott Squires, pleased to be joined by the energy expert Dan McTagg. Dan, a litany of things to talk about today, but first things first, gas prices, diesel, etc., adjusted in this region, Newfoundland and Labrador tomorrow, Thursday, the rest of Atlantic Canada on Friday. What can we expect in Newfoundland and Labrador tomorrow, and then the rest of Atlantic Canada on Friday?
Let's start with Newfoundland. They didn't have as big an increase as I thought they would, and so that might mean that we're going to get less of a decrease tomorrow for gasoline. I predict only a half penny decrease, when in fact it could be as much as a penny to a penny and a quarter. But let's leave it with that. There's a slight decrease for gasoline, and a little bit more of a decrease for diesel. So diesel will be down about a penny, maybe a little bit more. That may not hold for the rest of Atlantic Canada for Friday. So PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick may actually see a scenario where gas prices increase half a penny. And of course, diesel may be down only half a penny. Again, the extra day, looking at markets as they settle on Wednesday, it can make all the difference. We're seeing a bit of a rally in markets today, especially given that U.S. gasoline inventories dropped over 5 million barrels, which is pretty significant. Not surprising, given that many refineries are going through their early pre-spring adjustments and maintenance. But it does mean that there's going to continue to be that upward pressure on prices. Now, having said all that, we know that markets are in a bit of a funk. Hedgers and those running the markets are not necessarily, they don't necessarily have our backs, but they're doing everything they can to try to maintain stability in energy prices, even though fundamentals are pointing very dangerously to higher demand and lower supply. And they can only continue to ignore this for so long. By the way, I think it's fair to say that energy markets, especially money managers, hedgers, the big funds, are really all about climate change. And they're really about, ensuring that energy prices don't reflect or attract the kind of investments that they want to see otherwise go to green projects. It's all very complicated, but it does mean that we're dealing with a very different set of money managers and people investing in energy and distorting the price. What it means, though, is that we could see, and I think, never mind could, let me take that word away. We're going to see a snapback in prices that is going to be extraordinarily uncomfortable. Scott, you and I here at SaltWire have been talking with this for several weeks. It's coming. And it's coming at the worst of times when we have a switch over from winter to summer gasoline. That happens the 1st of April, or rather, the mid part of April. We know the carbon tax is up. That's going to be about nearly 4 cents a litre for gasoline, 4.5 for diesel here in Atlantic Canada. And of course, we're looking at a surge, probably about $10 a barrel, which could translate into about a 12 to 13 cent a litre increase. All told, imagine gasoline and diesel prices being anywhere from 15 to 20 cents a litre higher than what they are as soon as May.
Well, you referenced the carbon tax, and I know that's something that we've talked about a lot here on Prices at the Pumps. Seen some recent polling, Dan, that says 7 out of 10 Canadians, 70% of Canadians are against the increase in the carbon tax April 1st. And, here in Atlantic Canada, we've talked about the Atlantic premiers and how they quite often have pushed back against some of these pricing policies from the federal government. Just yesterday, Dan, Andrew Furey, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, I continue to stand up for Newfoundlanders and Labradorians against the federal carbon tax. I'm now asking Ottawa to pause its planned increase to the carbon tax set for April 1st, as the high cost of living is enough of a burden on families. The full letter is here. Again, this is from X. And then Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston. Again, this is yesterday. The Liberal carbon tax increase on April 1st will be painful for Nova Scotians. I wrote to the Prime Minister today calling on him to cancel the carbon tax hike. His letter is in his post on X. And then in New Brunswick, Blaine Higgs, yesterday again, Trudeau's carbon tax crippling New Brunswickers. In Fredericton, today, Blaine Higgs, Premier of New Brunswick, released the following statement calling on Justin Trudeau to cancel the carbon tax hike scheduled for April 1st. And again, that's from a post on X. And I know that you said that also Premier Dennis King of Prince Edward Island has done the same. When you see premiers going to this somewhat, I guess, extraordinary level of putting these posts out straight from their accounts with these letters to the Prime Minister, whether you want to think that it might be political gamesmanship or not, they've been pretty consistent, right, with their pushback. What does all this say to you, Dan?
Well, consistent and effective. Atlantic premiers, believe it or not, all four of them, speaking really from the same hymn book, have been very successful in, for instance, back in 2019, 2020, using our work at Canadians for Affordable Energy, our research that we had done to point out that the cost benefit analysis had not been done on the second carbon tax, the clean fuel standard. They were very successful in lobbying to get the clean fuel standard removed from things like heating furnace oil, things like coal and other factors that we may be using for heating. So they were successful in that regard. They were once again successful in ensuring that the clean fuel standard and more recently, the carbon tax would not apply to heating fuel. So I think with all four of them, regardless of what Scott Moe in Saskatchewan is doing, what Danielle Smith has been saying, what Doug Ford in Ontario has said, this carbon tax is terrible. The mere fact that you now have a majority of premiers, not just conservative ones, but obviously in the case of Furey, Anthony Furey, Andrew Furey, the Premier of Newfoundland, a Liberal Premier, I think carries significant weight. I'm going to go on a limb here. I think the Liberals under Justin Trudeau are certainly not the same Liberals I worked with, and they didn't really give much of a damn for consumers. And they like spending money they don't have, and they came out with these net zero goals, which I think should be referred to as nix the net zero. But I think they're going to be forced to do this. And I would expect that in the budget, Chrystia Freeland should, probably won't, but we could see an indication of the federal government putting a pause on that as well. Because if they don't, it's going to be they're going to be destroyed. I don't think there'll be 15 or 20 Liberals elected in Canada in 20 months when this government has the requirement, along with the NDP, to face the music. So we'll see what happens. But if they hold strong to this, I would think that it's probably a Hail Mary pass for them. And I think this may be the last positive stand that they can take that I think would redeem them in the eyes of the public. They cannot, Scott, afford another 5-cent increase for diesel, or 4.5 cents for diesel, and 4 cents for gasoline, on top of what I've said is going to emerge, which you and I have been talking about for some time. The clean fuel standard is going to add another 4 cents a litre come July 1st here in the provinces. We're going to see, that's the second carbon tax. We're going to see the Canadian energy position here in this country with a weak Canadian dollar see higher prices as a result of oil going up about $10 a barrel. We're also going to see, of course, that switch over from winter to summer gasoline. All those things combined, it's going to make it impossible for Canadians to move.
And Dan, I'll ask you this one because I haven't really been able to find out all of this money that's being collected as the carbon tax. Where is it going and what's it being spent on?
Well, we know it's not revenue neutral. We know that it's probably in the order of $7 or $8 billion the federal government is collecting. And while some of that is rebated, in fact, all of it, as far as some of the proposals are rebated, there's a lot that is not. The GST, HST, for instance, isn't rebated. We're not sure who it goes to if the federal government's using part of this to increase the oversight and create the bureaucracy around green initiatives. So the Parliamentary Budget Officer made it very, very clear. This is the person that looks at all government policies and says, what's the cost? The government's claim, as we know, was that most Canadians would receive more than what they actually pay as a result of these carbon taxes. Well, it turns out that that's very narrow and that's not true. And what we've seen is that in 60 to 70% of cases, middle income and higher would get less and be impacted even more. So that aside, I have a feeling that what we're going to be seeing here is a carbon tax in which scrutiny is going to start to be put on exactly where every penny is going, because right now it's very clear that it is not revenue neutral. And those advocating it know that as well. It's just that they continue this sort of falsehood that it's a great thing because when does government give you more than what you pay? It's a little bit of a bribe, and I think a lot of people are not falling for it anymore.
Well, something that I think about as well, a personal or a household rebate is one thing, but what about businesses? What about warehouses? What about schools that have to fill their tanks with oil? They are all paying the carbon tax on their fuel, whether it's oil, natural gas, propane, etc. Are they getting rebates that you know of, Dan?
Well, they have something called output-based pricing, which basically means that they too have to take these controls and they get some consideration for the price that they're paying. And so sometimes they are given a bit of a rebate themselves, not directly as consumers, but they can qualify and mitigate the impact. But that's not everyone, and there's a whole list of people and circumstances where these kind of taxes apply and don't apply, and where they might be able to get relief or be alleviated from the burden. Doesn't happen in all instances, but if you look at some of the stuff on the federal government website, you'll see that overall it does increase the impact on inflation and the cost of doing business in this country, because not everybody's exempted. And so for that reason, because of all the exemptions that are out there, a lot of institutional organizations, non-governmental organizations are still forced to pay, whether indirectly or directly. And by indirect, I mean that, for instance, the paper company that supplies them had to take a vehicle, fill that vehicle with whatever stationery that they have, drive it to that particular business. That company used diesel or gasoline. The price of that material went up and that stationery increased. So they have to pay for it ultimately and pass that back on to, if it happens to be an institution, to you and I as taxpayers.
And then all of this talk about carbon taxes and different things that hit consumers in the wallet leads me to a number of posts and stories that I've seen recently talking about Canadian standard of living and how it's lagging behind, and certainly lagging behind our neighbors to the south, the United States. When you see reports like that, or for the average person that sees that and says, well, the Canadian standard of living is dropping or going down, what does that mean?
Well, it's basically a theory, an economic theorem, which basically says it's per capita to GDP. It's a pretty, and there's usually a few standards in which they measure that. They look at, for instance, the income per person against the cost of actually doing things, and they measure that usually on a historical basis. They look at the income per person. They look at the poverty rate. Those are usually the areas that they go in. Some people say there's other factors. There's 4 or 5 factors involved, but those are the ones that we measure, and it's done internationally. And what we're seeing is increasingly the cost of living in Canada, as well as the large amount of debt that most Canadians have, proportional to the size of their wealth and to the size of the economy, continues to show downward pressure. In other words, Canadians are starting to fall behind. There's other ways of measuring that. Some do the GDP per capita on labor, in which case our productivity isn't just dropping, it's dropping like a stone. We were usually just behind the United States on productivity per person. That was probably in the past, the past 20 years or so. We weren't far from the U.S. We're now, between now and 2060, going to wind up dead last among the 60 members of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. That's a very scary prospect, because it means a country that has really a measure of affordability and prosperity is now seeing that disappear, not just with higher costs, but with higher debts and with people struggling to make ends meet. Certainly, issues like green policies, which are extraordinarily pernicious to a country like Canada, when you drive up the cost of everything, and you not just do it with one tax, but you do it with 2 taxes. Remember, the Clean Fuel Standard adds to that burden, especially here in Atlantic Canada and British Columbia. And when you then take and attack the very industries that are providing wealth and good jobs and supporting the infrastructure of this country, manufacturing, which has left Canada to a large extent, oil and gas, which has been hemmed in by a federal government and its friends and allies and the Greens and the NDP saying no more pipelines. We can't get our product to market even when the world wants it. It affects the value of the Canadian dollar, because we price everything in US terms. We're seeing a continuation, the deterioration of our purchase power. So all of those things combined are really lessening the prosperity that Canadians have been struggling for and enjoying over the past couple of decades has now begun to recede. And with that, I think the future of the country looks very bleak as long as we continue on this path of trying to borrow to maintain our prosperity. I note, for instance, the federal government, as a substitute for dropping labor numbers, employment is now the biggest employer in the country in terms of the amount of the size of the civil service, which has increased 40% in the past 7 or 8 years. That's a very dangerous sign.
And then, of course, We talk about a lot of different factors to do with energy and how it affects Canada and consumers. And, a lot of what we talk about with carbon taxes, which are to basically make driving your vehicle more expensive and to push you into something else, especially an electric vehicle. We know all about the push towards EVs. Saw this on BBC World News yesterday. Chinese technology giant Xiaomi says it will start deliveries of its first electric vehicle this month. Its first ever foray into the competitive automotive industry. The car's price is expected to be announced March 28th. China's fifth largest smartphone maker says it has 59 stores in 29 cities around the country to take orders. They're going to take orders for cars at their phone stores. At the unveiling of the Speed Ultra 7 SUV last year, Xiaomi's chief executive Li Jun said the company aims to become one of the top 5 car makers in the world. We can go on and on, but you can find that article on BBC World News. Dan, we've talked about EVs and China and them entering into the market and basically trying to dominate it. What does this story tell you about where China is with their EV production?
Well, it's a story for everybody in Canada, North America, and Europe. When China gets involved, or you go to China to build cheaper things, Canadians buy them, Americans buy them, North Americans buy them. So do the Europeans. Same thing is going to happen, except with one important caveat. China led the world long before it was cool because they couldn't break into the internal combustion engine manufacturing of vehicles. So they went EV 12 years before we did. It's no wonder that companies like Tesla make a lot of their batteries and a lot of their products, not just for sale over there, but actually manufacture them there as well. So what it really means is that we're about to have our proverbial lunches eaten well before it's even delivered. By that, I mean that your federal government, in its coolness, decided to, again, refuse to look before it leapt, threw away $60 billion in commitments to Northvolt, to Volkswagen, and to Stellantis, which, of course, for people is Chrysler and Renault and a few others, decided, and Fiat, and decided to invest money on batteries at a certain price point, which China is about to undercut dramatically. Now, of course, there will be duties and tariffs and other things considered, but one has to be very careful because if one brings in one of these vehicles, a BYD, for instance, or a NIO at a third the price of the cost of a battery to develop here in Canada, the game, as I said earlier, is over even before it begins. Nobody in the right mind, subsidy or otherwise, which comes from taxpayers, is going to buy, an $80,000, $90,000 Tesla, much less a new Volkswagen battery rabbit, if you will, at $40,000 when you can buy them for $15,000. So that's what we're faced with. It is an important move. It was very predictable, but now with a glut in China, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Now, with a glut of over 4.5 million cars in China, they're going to want to dump them somewhere. They're going to want to liquidate them, and they're going to continue building them. So, I think Canada needs to really swallow some smartening up pills very quickly, because that was a waste of money. It was a very stupid policy. It was a fine example of where short-sightedness, trendiness, all conspired to making for bad, terrible public policy, which you and I and our grandchildren even are going to be paying for well after we're gone.
Dan, that's why we're so happy and appreciative to have you here each week to wade through some of these headlines that the average person, may not be able to dig into, but we certainly like digging into it with you. And I know that folks like to dig into things with you right back, especially on X. So when you're not with us here on SaltWire, Dan, where can folks connect with you, engage with you, find you?
Well, engaging is always fun at Gas Price Wizard on X, or formerly known Twitter. Policy, I'm still writing, Canadians for Affordable Energy, or affordableenergy.ca. You need to contact me, president@affordableenergy.ca. And of course, the engagement is always respectful. But as you know, as many of my followers know, and those who have left, you get what you give. And if it's respectful, it's respectful. If you want to go a little lower, no problem. You may not like the result, though.
Always an entertaining and engaging follow with you, Dan, on X. We appreciate your time as always. Enjoy the rest of your week, my friend. Have a great weekend. Enjoy, hopefully, some warmer, milder spring-like weather. And we'll connect again next week as we get closer to April 1st.
Looking forward to that. Not April 1st, of course.
Thank you, Dan.
Take care, Scott.